This video is a follow-up of the 2003 Nissan Frontier D22 engine conversion. We are trying to swap or install a Nissan VQ35DE engine from the 2002 year model production into a 2003 Nissan Frontier D22. This type of assembly will not be found from the factory manufacturer. So what we have before us here on the left side is a engine wiring harness for the 2002 Nissan Pathfinder USA Federal model. On the right side, we have a wiring harness for the 2002 VQ35DE engine wiring harness with its ECU beside. We do not know the make and model vehicle this right side harness and ECU was removed from, since the eBay seller advertisement was most extraordinary in listing it as a 2000 to 2004 Pathfinder QX4. To the left side is the Federal US model wiring harness, which is similar but not identical to the right side harness. Before we can select either one of these harnesses for engine installation and operation inside of the 2003 Nissan Frontier D22, we must specify the wires, circuit, color, and its pin location on the ECU harness plug. We also need to verify its connection of the ECU harness into the main harness, which is situated under the dashboard and most likely communicate with the gauge cluster, evap system, and other options including fuel pump and ground with power distribution from the fuse block. When we take a close look at the US Federal model harness, this is the conduit that will most likely be bolted against the firewall, and then the ECU harness will enter the cabin, the interior cabin, on the left side of the vehicle and place under the dashboard next to the steering column. So this is the main harness that will go in to the dash harness that will communicate with the gauge cluster, the evap system, ground, and the fuse main block. This harness here is located over here for this JDM harness, which we still cannot identify. So those plugs that I just showed you was cut off from this part of the harness, and it continues down to where it will make all its connection into this ECU. So what we have basically do, I have basically dissect the harness by removing its socket from inside its harness connector for identification and labeling based on the vehicle factory service manual. In the video description link, you will see a video showing this right side harness attached to the engine and how it's located when we receive it. To the left side of the video is a newly used harness we are assuming from a 2002 Nissan Pathfinder R50 US Federal model. So when we take another look at this harness, we will see this pink connector, which is basically a junction for grounding all the wire in the ECU harness. You're going to see that same ground connector on this JDM harness during the process of dissecting it. These are the three ground connectors that connects all these ground cable into one circuit for the ECU. When we take a look at the Federal USA wiring harness, we could see the plug and the ECU socket is the same as the JDM ECU socket and its harness plug. A closer look at the harness plug, you will notice there is a set of colors of connectors. We have orange, blue, green, yellow, and white. These are sockets that are inserted into that gray harness plug, and this is what they look like. This is the green one, this is the yellow, this is the white, here we have the blue, and this is the orange, and on the side are grays for additional circuit. Those two gray plugs are the side of the ECU harness socket itself, and those wires will need to be individually removed from inside of these pin location. That will be these two gray plugs. This one is on the left side and this one is on the right side. We could verify that because when we look at the bottom you can see a white placement. Now as we're looking at this Federal US 2002 Pathfinder wiring harness, we're going to notice we have two shield cable here, and these two shield cable travel up in this harness and enter into the main harness that's inside the vehicle under the dashboard. These two shield wire are mostly the crankshaft position sensor for the front and rear crankshaft, like we have over here on the JDM harness. You see these two shield wire are cut, so we can only assume that these two shield wire are identical to the one we just took a look at that goes into the main harness. But we already know that these two shield wire is cut from the engine crankshaft position sensor front and rear harness. These two shield cable are the two crankshaft position sensor on the front and rear of the engine. When we take a look at where they are connected, they go directly into the ECU harness. One of those shield cable have a yellow wire which is located at pin 21 on the ECU, and the other one is a green wire which goes to pin number 12 on the ECU. This black and white and gray wire that comes out of the shield cable and the orange with the gray wire that comes out of the two shield cable are all connected at this juncture for ground. This is the yellow wire from the shield cable at pin location 21 in the orange connector. This green wire, which is from the shield cable for the crankshaft position sensor, is at pin location number 12 on the ECU harness in the blue block just above the orange block, where that yellow wire for the other shield cable is located. Here is where we could verify that those two shield wires are cut from, because they go their way down into this crankshaft position sensor and the front crankshaft position sensor. When we take a look at this cable, we'll see it's light green and gray, while the other one is completely gray with no other color. These two shield cable basically continues at a junction or a plug into the main harness like this. Red and gray, and this one is totally gray. So what's happening here is that these shield cable meet a junction point where it was connected by a plug. Here you can see we have already placed a tag on a few of the wire for labeling and making connection when we are ready to install this harness into the Nissan Frontier D22. Our next step is to identify these wires by the color and pin location for tagging and identification when ready to convert into the Nissan Frontier main harness under the dashboard. So by looking at this harness, we could always see some of the wires in all three of these main plug will go to the ECU, and some of them will go down into the sensors. This is where we have to determine which wire in these main plug goes to the sensor and the ECU harness plug. We will do this by looking at the 2002 Nissan Frontier Federal US model service manual from the dealership to identify the color are the same and the pin location in the socket are also the same. If these circuit and color code wire fail to match as the vehicle service manual, we will have to stop and make sure we could find the appropriate wiring schematic blueprint for identifying the wire, circuit, color. Here I have the 2002 Federal harness and the 2000 JDM harness. And when we look at that green wire where it's inserted, we're going to notice on the JDM plug, that wire is of a different color. So we have to check this wire to see if it's connected at the crankshaft harness shield cable where it's cut. So first we want to trace this wire physically. We can see it basically goes in to this shield wire right here. This is the shield cable. So we have to follow this shield cable by tugging on it to see where it exists in the harness, and most likely this is the wire right here. So we have to keep following it and see if it comes out here where we have a wire of the same color and gauge. As we continue tugging on that wire, we can see that wire does not make it exit here. Instead it's here, and it continues down into the harness. So right away we have already confirmed that this wire, which should be a crankshaft position sensor as verified by the green wire in the US model, is not the same. So let's confirm the location of this wire that we have already identified to suspect to be one of the crankshaft position sensor. So when we follow that wire, you see it goes to this plug. And when we look at the back of the plug, we see the white wire on one side of its two pin. So this harness connects to. Let's physically check this wire for a live feed by placing our probe into that pin location. Following that wire, we will see it continues here with its two ground terminal. So that wire goes all the way here, and we can pick it up right here. You can see it goes into, this is the camshaft sensor. So now I want to remove this from this connector, and I'm going to test it to see if this wire is a live connect. Here we can see the light bulb has become illuminated by our test tool, letting us know that this circuit is a live circuit and is 1. It is now appropriate to tag this wiring harness at its socket with its sensor name for future reference. The next wire is basically a series of wire which consists of this black and yellow wire and this light green wire, which is located in pin 14 for the black and yellow, 17 for the light green. When we trace these wires by following them, you see they merge into one with a single ground cable, and then it continues on to that green and gray, which basically end up here at the mass airflow sensor plug. So we're going to tag this as the mass airflow sensor. This white wire and pink and black wire will be followed in the wiring harness. This is a part where we physically want to inspect this harness by stripping away this conduit, because you can see here we have 2 pink and black wires which exit at the other end. So we must confirm this by visual inspection. With the wire for the mass airflow finally segregated, we will continue to following it to the ECU harness plug for locating. That pink and black wire continues here and basically splits into 2. One of the pink and black wire going to the main harness where the plug is cut from. We could see that pink and black wire. When we follow that other pink and black wire in the engine harness, we will see again that pink and black wire splits into 3 separate pink and black wire. This automatically tells us that this pink and black wire is a power distribution wire from the fuse block and will be tagged when it is appropriately identified at the ECU. So when we follow this pink and black wire to the ECU wiring harness plug, we will notice that this wire shows up at pin 104 on the left side of the ECU harness plug. With the wire finally tagged as a power supply, we must now go and investigate that white wire. This is that white wire right next to the pink and black wire. You see it goes down here and basically come into a juncture here where it diverts into 3. So this one is part of this harness with the pink wire, which goes to the main inside the vehicle. But this other wire going back, following that same white wire to the ECM, we can see that it splits here into 2. One is diverted to that same power block at its lower left, and the other is diverted into the same power block above the other white wire. In that process of division or diversion, the wire takes another twin juncture into 2 different shield cable. So now we have to trace these 2 shield cable for the sensor location. But we must first find where the other end of this white wire in the harness ends up on the engine. That white wire ends up in the center location of this plug because the one next to it is green and white. So now we must follow that pin for that white wire in the center top pin of this engine harness. The test tool has confirmed for us that this wire is at this TPS location next to the same green and white wire. So let's test that. Okay, in the background you notice the connection to the TPS. That's our light bulb Now I will grab the other end and place it on the third pin and look for the light bulb to illuminate itself, which tells us this is a live circuit. It is now appropriate to tag that white wire with a TPS sign signaling its circuit. Okay, we're back to the midway point of finding out where these two shield cable exists on the engine, since they branch off from that white wire that we have just indicated as a TPS wire. One of those two gray and white wires separate and goes in to this camshaft sensor, and it also divides itself back to the ECU harness. But first, let's finish up by following this second wire across the engine for its location, which is indicating into these two wires, which goes to the left side camshaft position sensor and then makes its route back to the ECU. The gray and white wire with this additional gray wire from the camshaft position sensor continues on down and come together as three wire. So we have to remember one of the wire was sending a signal, and this additional wire is coming from the signal of the left side camshaft position sensor, while this gray wire is a return from the camshaft position sensor on the right side. So let's continue to see where these three shield cable exists at its color harness plug. Two of those gray and white shield wire are basically connected into this single white wire juncture for power distribution block, or most likely a ground. Since this wire tends to merge with additional cable, it's a sign that it could be a wire for shielding the wire or grounding the wire. Now when we look at the additional gray wire, we can see this goes into the orange pin, and that's pin ID number 22 on the ECM harness plug. We want to go back to that sensor harness for the camshaft position sensor and look at the construction of the wire as it enters into the sensor. So we basically can see these two white wire are separate signal, and one is for ground. Now we could basically say this wire, which is the gray wire that we just traced back to the ECU, is on pin number 22. That will be the gray and white shield wire that return at the ECU. We would form a juncture into one single wire to the ECU side block. Let's take a look at oxygen sensor number 1. In bank 1, we will see it has a black and white wire with a black wire and a white and gray shield cable. So we're going to follow this black and white wire, and this basically ends at the juncture where the main harness plug was cut away. So this is labeled as a potential ground or power cable. But now we must follow this solid black cable which comes down here. That's this cable right here. So here we notice that solid black wire, and it travel into this conduit, and it basically comes out here, which basically O2 sensor 1, bank 1, goes into this white connector. We take a look at the back. So this will be pin number 65 on the white plug for the harness. Okay, now let's trace this gray and white wire, which is along right here, comes down here. See, it's moving here. So we have already established there's a ground or shield wire for this cable. which we basically knot on the side. So when we follow this up, you see it says O2 sensor, sensor 1, bank 1, and this goes into the blue connector at pin harness number 5 on the blue connector. Let's follow through by checking oxygen sensor number 2 in bank 1 for its circuitry. So here again we see another black and white wire, and this wire basically ends at where main harness was cut off. So we will have to verify whether this is a power or ground wire later on. Also with this bank 1 sensor 2 harness is a pink and black wire, which will require following again. And as we can see, it shows up right here, and we basically want to tug on it. We see it goes into this main harness, and here we see the pink wire continue on into pin number 63, so that's 6 slots in. Let's continue by looking at this red and gray wire from sensor 2 in bank 1. When we tug on this wire, we could see it's basically come down here where we have 2 wire for shielding and ground. Here we signal that the wire is sensor 2 bank 1. When we follow that wire, you see it goes into pin number 15. That will be right here on the blue connector. Okay, so this has confirmed the 2 oxygen sensor for bank 1. Now let's move to bank 2 and confirm the primary oxygen sensor and the secondary oxygen sensor. When we look closely at the harness and the wire entering the plug, we notice that black and white wire, which is right here, it's already been signaled as a ground, which will be verified later on. So it comes into this harness here, and you see it splits off into 3, but it continues into 1. We're going to follow this one, and it goes here into another ground juncture, and it's ground with this other sensor, this hydraulic sensor. But we must continue the ground that we were following, that's on this harness, and we can see that wire comes down here, and this is also where the main plug is cut. So here you're going to see on this single wire, which is most likely a ground wire, is the left cam adjuster, the swirl valve solenoid, and that oxygen sensor that we have just identified. So the left cam sensor and swirl valve is located. Here we can see that black and white wire for the swirl control. That's the power valve right here, controls that. So this is the swirl control solenoid, and that cam sensor is this sensor right here. You can see the black and white wire in there. So that has confirmed the 3 ground for that single wire. Back to oxygen sensor number 1 on bank 2, we will follow this yellow wire, which basically comes out here, and we have already located it's at pin 66. So we're going to follow this all the way down, and here we see it's moving down here. Keep following it. So here is that wire exiting this conduit, basically comes out here, oxygen sensor 1 bank 2, and this goes to pin, that will be this wire right here, this yellow wire, that will be pin number 66 on the white connector. Now we have that center black wire to locate, and it's most likely inside this shield cable, which is a solid gray wire. Will have to be followed, and here we can see it right there. So that's this wire. Continue on following it, and that's it right here. So you check back here, you see it's moving. You always have to tug on the wire to keep a trace of it. Here we notice that sensor 1 in bank 2 is located right next to sensor 1 in bank 1 at pin number 6 on the blue connector. Let's verify sensor number 2 in bank 2, which is this green plug, and we can see we have a red and blue, a totally red, a white, and also a black and white. That black wire for the secondary oxygen sensor in bank 1 ends up at this juncture again. So this basically splits into many different ground, but we want to follow this ground wire which merge into the ground for oxygen sensor number 1 in bank 2, and it continues on this line, traveling down again, merging into this harness, and again it comes down to where it's cut at the main harness. So again, this is why the sensor is labeled sensor 1 bank 2 for the oxygen sensor, because it's a ground. And there you see on the back, all ground. So we've already verified that this is a swirl control solenoid ground also. Let's take a look at that blue and red wire for sensor 2 in bank 2. Now when we follow that wire, we see that blue and red wire right here. We're going to continue taking a look at it down the line. So I'm going to basically pull on this wire so we see it shows up here. Now I'm going to follow this wire. Here we can see it goes along here, and again it goes into the main conduit. Here is that blue and white wire, which is oxygen sensor number 2 in bank 2. This is located on pin number 64 on the white connector. Okay, we are complete with verifying sensor 1 in bank 2 and sensor 2 in bank 2 for the oxygen sensor. Also sensor 1 in bank 1 and sensor 2 in bank 2 are completely referenced with the ECU and the main harness. Let's verify the wiring circuit for this coolant temperature sensor, which we already know communicate with the gauge cluster for monitoring. So here we can see a yellow and red wire. So when we follow this wire, we can see it's right here. And it's right here. We keep tugging on it. Eventually we're going to pull it out, because I already know this goes into the main harness and does not communicate with the ECU. Instead, this is the coolant temperature sensor that communicates with the ECU, and as we can see, it has a green and black wire. So let's, with one end of our test probe inserted onto the black wire at the coolant temperature sensor harness, we will locate that black wire on this harness socket plug. When we take a close look, you see at the bottom of the plug, there is our black wire to the left on the bottom. By placing the other end of the test probe onto the pin, we see the light bulb illuminate itself, confirming that this is a live circuit. Here is that black wire as it enters that plug that we just tested. So I just want to pull on it. See, it's here. And I want to pull on it. It's here. And it's basically showing up here. So it's here. And here we can see it comes in to pin number 10 on the blue connector. We will label this black wire at its harness connector with pin number 10 for future reference. This has complete our research for the coolant temperature sensor, for the gauge cluster, and the ECU. We will finish this wiring dissection process later, but this evap sensor and also the TPS sensor, the idle air control sensor, and the coil does not compare to the factory service manual and these harness. This video has basically turned out to be something that it's not meant to be, since the Nissan dealer manufacturer has committed a fraud in these wiring harness by placing irrelevant information when compared to the books. So we can now say that this video is to prove that the Nissan Automotive Company is a total fraud in their manufacturing, and their vehicle is not meant for car enthusiasts, or if you like cars, Nissan will not like you to get affiliated with their cars, because the books that they print are toy books and are not information leading to their product.